Good afternoon. Hello, everybody. It is wonderful to see all of you here. And on behalf of the Education Committee, I would like to welcome you to what I know will be a wonderful presentation by our friend and neighbor, Jack Bucceri. A few housekeeping things first. Please take your cell phone and either silence it or turn it off so the talk is not interrupted. If you need listening devices, and if you raise your hand, Brian will bring something to you. May I ask, how many in this group are veterans or spouses of veterans? And how many in this group are veterans or spouses of Vietnam veterans? So you're talking to a crowd, a number of whom, Jack, have had not exactly the same experience, I know, but at least they were there.
Very good.
And I am now going to turn the program over to our speaker because I know you want to hear him and not me.
Okay.
Oh, one other thing. I was asked by the speaker to say this, and I almost forgot. Please hold your questions to the end. There will be plenty of time for them. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Jill. Okay, a very important question. How do you hear me?
Great. Loud and clear.
Loud and clear, right? Okay, thank you. Now, before I begin, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't take a moment and remember this is the 24th anniversary of September 11th, 2001, with the terrible terrorist attacks on our country. I think we all remember where we were around 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning when we first got the news that the World Trade Center had been hit, and then later the second tower, then the Pentagon, and then, of course, Flight 93 that crashed in Pennsylvania. So let's take a moment and just reflect on the almost 3,000 Americans that died in those attacks and the heroic first responders that put themselves at risk in their response to that attack. Let's just take a moment of silence, please. Okay, thank you. So it's been, in 2025 marks the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War, a war that ended in 1975. A war that I believe affected everybody in our generation. Some of us volunteered for service, some of us were drafted, some of us got a deferment for educational purposes, some of us were protesters. But in some way, it touched all our lives. The end of the war is defined by the communist forces overrunning Saigon, which was the capital then of South Vietnam. Who of us can forget the haunting images that we saw as the helicopters were on the roof of the American embassy evacuating American personnel? This is a photo of a helicopter on the top of the embassy, and you can see all of the people that were waiting in line to get on that helicopter. And that line stretched all the way to the ground and beyond in the embassy compound. In a few days, there were 6,500 people that were evacuated. 1,500 of them were U.S. personnel, but 5,000 of them were Vietnamese civilians who were desperate to get out of Saigon. It was the biggest helicopter rescue in history. And those 6,500 people were taken by helicopter to waiting U.S. ships that were anchored off the coast of Vietnam. There were so many helicopters flying so many people, there was no longer room on the carriers for the helicopters to land. Here's a photo of U.S. personnel pushing a helicopter off the deck of a carrier because there was not enough room on the carrier to land the airplanes. So today, I'm going to talk about my experience as a Marine helicopter pilot in Vietnam in 1967 and 1968. I'm going to talk about the training that I had in going there and the events that I was involved in with my squadron. And I'm also going to talk about my personal feelings and emotions that I felt in going through those events. But my story is unique to me. Everybody who served in Vietnam has their own story. And we have at least eight Vietnam veterans in the audience with us today. And I'd like to introduce each of them and in turn, and then ask, after I've introduced them, for them all to stand up so they can be recognized. First, up here in the first row are three Hill residents who were Army veterans. And in the back of the room, Jim Walkarski, who is also an Army veteran. Another resident is Don Kahn, who is back in the back of the room there. Don, if you'd raise your hand. Don was a flight surgeon, and he served in Vietnam. So first we have Bill Raish here, Army, John Braxton, Army, and Evan Silverstein, Army. In addition to these three up here, I have two friends that are visiting today, both Army veterans, Mike Haggerty and Bob Eyre. And we have a special visitor today that I would like to introduce. His name is Walt Stewart. And Walt, right here, Walt served 35 years in the Army. He was a helicopter pilot in the Army, and he served in Vietnam. And in addition to all that, before he retired, he was at the rank of Major General. Walt, thanks for coming today. Could you all please stand up? Could you please stand up and Bob. Don. Thank you. So to understand a bit about the Vietnam War, it's really important to ask a couple of questions. What were the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese fighting for? And why was the United States involved in this conflict? And to understand that, it's helpful to know a little bit of history about Vietnam. Now, on this map of Vietnam, you can see this is the way Vietnam is today. It's a unified Vietnam. It wasn't like this in 1968. In 1968, there were two countries, the North under communist rule and the South non-communist. And right in the middle, there was a demilitarized zone that separated the two countries. To the north of Vietnam is China. And to the west is Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos. To the east is the China Sea. So Vietnam, in much of its history, was an occupied country by foreign nations. For example, in the first millennium, the Chinese occupied Vietnam for 900 years. In fact, they treated Vietnam as a province of China. The French occupied for 100 years, from 1850 to World War II. The Japanese during World War II. After World War II, the Vietnamese declared their independence from France, but France had different ideas. They wanted to hold on to their colony. And so what ensued was a 9-year brutal war called the Indochina War. At the end of that 9 years, France was defeated, and there was a treaty signed in Geneva that divided the country into the North and the South. There were supposed to be elections held to let the Vietnamese people determine how they wanted to be ruled, whether it be communist or non-communist. Those elections never took place. So in 1959, the Viet Cong, which was a group in South Vietnam that sympathized with the North, they began an insurrection to topple the South Vietnamese government. They were actually the surrogates of the North Vietnamese. They were supplied by the North Vietnamese. And the North Vietnamese, in turn, were supported by China and Russia. So the Vietnamese felt they were fighting for their independence and to unify the country under communism. So why was the U.S. there? Well, in 1955, the United States signed a treaty called the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO for short. It was patterned after NATO in Europe, and it had the same goals, which was to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. The signers of that treaty were the U.S., Great Britain, France, the Philippines, and Australia. So in that time of our history, there was a theory called the domino theory. You may remember hearing about the domino theory. And it held that if one of the countries in Southeast Asia were taken over by communism, they would all fall to communism. The domino theory, like a row of dominoes falling over one at a time. So that was the theory. So in early 1960s, the United States, under the Kennedy administration, began to aid the South Vietnamese by sending military advisors and by sending arms, money and material and arms. So, where did I come into all this? Well, here is a chronology of my service in the Marine Corps. So I began active duty in 1966 by going to flight school in Pensacola, Florida. I was awarded my wings 15 months later. I served a tour in Vietnam of 13 months in 1967 and 68. I was discharged in 1970, 5 years before the end of the war. But my story really begins sooner than that, and it's 1963 when I was in college at Gannon University in Erie, Pennsylvania. Gannon, like so many schools at that time, had a ROTC program, Reserve Officer Training. And for us, it was compulsory. You had to do 2 years in going to classes, learning about military history, and marching once a week. So, I didn't like ROTC that much. But the Marine Corps had an alternative, and the alternative is called the Platoon Leaders Corps. And its goal was, just like the Army, to train officers to serve in the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps alternative, there was no school year activities. Instead, you went in the summer for 6 weeks to Quantico, Virginia, where the Marine Corps has a large presence in Quantico. And so I went 2 summers for 6 weeks each summer. It was like boot camp. It was like going to Paris Island, only it was in Quantico. So it was rigorous training, and it was designed to weed people out, to have attrition, because the feeling was not everybody is suited to be a Marine Corps officer. And so there was about 25% of the candidates that began the program that didn't finish, either because they quit or because they were washed out. So I did that, and I did well at it. And so when I graduated in 1966, I was awarded a commission in the Marine Corps. Now, those are all the logical reasons why I joined the Marine Corps. Here's the real reason. Okay, I love that uniform. I still do. And here's my friend here in his dress blues. These are called Marine dress blues. The recruiters, when they came to the campus, would wear this uniform. They knew what they were doing. They got me. So, let me just say a couple of words about the Marine Corps, because this year is the 250th anniversary of the Marine Corps. Its birthday will be 250 years on November 10th. And the Marine Corps was founded in Philadelphia, in Society Hill, near the Penn's Landing area. It was founded because that year there was a Continental Congress in Philadelphia that authorized the formation of the Continental Marines. And here's a plaque that shows that. Now, let me just back up one and say that the Marine Corps has always had a close relationship with the Navy. That's because the Marine Corps fights off of ships. In fact, the name Marine is derived from the fact that we fight off of ships, therefore Marines. I'd just like to make something very clear. The Marine Corps has a close association with the Navy, but we're not part of the Navy. Some of you have the erroneous idea that the Marine Corps is part of the Navy. So after the Continental Congress authorized the formation of the Marines, they began to recruit. And where did they go to recruit? They went to a tavern. They knew where the guys were. And so the birthplace of the Marine Corps is considered to be Tun Tavern in Old Philadelphia. It no longer exists, but a replica is being built and will be finished, I think, in 2026. So fighting off of ships, one of the most famous type of picture is in the Pacific in World War II, when the Marines would depart the ships and they'd be heading to the beach in the Pacific Islands. So it was a natural kind of evolution that as modern warfare developed, the Marine Corps began to adopt helicopters to transport the Marines from the ships to the beach. Here's a picture of a Navy ship in 1968. It's a carrier, and on board of that carrier are Marine helicopters. This is the kind of ship that we flew off in Vietnam. So I departed Gannon University in early 1966 and headed south to Florida for flight school. And that was to the panhandle of Florida, Pensacola. There's a naval air station in Pensacola that is more than just one airfield. It's a complex of airfields that are designed to train different types of aircraft. But everybody, Marine Corps and Navy pilots, all begin in Pensacola. And our first part of our training was flying in a Beechcraft T-34 trainer. And we would get 15 hours of instruction. There would be an instructor with us on each flight, and it was learning the basics of flight. And after 15 hours, if you were still with the program, then you got to solo. This is a picture of me in 1966. This proves without a doubt that 60 years ago I had dark hair. Didn't we all? And here we also did classroom work, where we learned aeronautics, how a wing works, how lift is created, the rules of flight, and other aspects of flying. But you know, the thing I remember most from this class, it's funny the things that you remember. The instructor was talking to us and he said, now you're going to be flying propeller-driven aircraft. He said, I want you to think about that propeller as a big fan. If it stops, you start to sweat. Okay, here's a picture of the T-34, and you can see the pilot in the front seat. This must be a solo flight because if it was a training flight, there would be an instructor in the back seat. This was a great aircraft. It could go about 200 miles an hour. And I remember very vividly my first solo flight. Everybody who's ever is a pilot and has soloed, everybody remembers their first solo flight. I remember being up by myself over the Florida Panhandle thinking, how cool is this? And I'm doing it myself. So once this phase of training was complete, we moved on to another phase and another aircraft in a different airfield in Pensacola area. And here's that aircraft. This was a much bigger and more powerful plane that went about 300 miles an hour. This was used extensively in Vietnam, South Vietnamese Air Force, and they used it as a bomber. So in this aircraft, there was two things that are very important about the training here. One was we began instrument training. All Marine Corps and naval pilots are trained in instruments. And that's very important. There are visual flight rules, which means you have enough visibility to fly the airplane. But what happens when you run into bad weather? And it's very important then to be trained on instruments so that we could fly. If we ran into bad weather, we could go to instruments and we could complete the mission and we could get back home safely. The other thing that we did in this phase of training is we began night training, night flying, first with instructors and then eventually a solo flight ourselves. And same thing, just like the solo flight I mentioned earlier, when you get up there at night for the first time by yourself, it's a wonderful feeling. So at the end of this phase of training, we had been in training here about 9 or 10 months. And at this point, everybody transitioned into a different aircraft. You either went to jets, or you went to transports, or to helicopters. They had something called a dream sheet. You got to put down what you wanted to fly. And for the Marine pilots, it really was a dream sheet, because 90% of us went into helicopters. At the time, there was a huge buildup in Vietnam. There was a need for helicopter pilots, so that's where I went, into helicopters. So, starting helicopter training, I went to another airfield and began to fly the Bell H-13. Here's a picture of the Bell. This is called the MASH helicopter as well. If you ever watched the MASH TV program, it was on this helicopter that the wounded would be brought in to Hawkeye and the other members of the cast, right? This was a difficult airplane to fly, especially when you're learning helicopters in the beginning. It was very unstable. There's really no computers or hydraulics on this to assist. The pilot's controls were directly linked through cables to the rotor overhead and the tail rotor in the back. So it was a difficult aircraft to bring into a hover. In a helicopter, you want to be able to hold it still, not be going backwards, up and down, back and forth. So it was tough to fly that aircraft. So much so that it was used to train astronauts, NASA astronauts, because it was very similar to the characteristics of the lunar module, which would be landed on the moon. So while I was in training, there was 10 astronauts with us that came through the training with us. They spent 6 weeks with us learning this aircraft. Now, at this point, I'd like to point out something. This book is in our library, and you can see that it's the same aircraft that's on the screen up here. This book was written by Robert Ferrier. Robert is the brother of John Ferrier, who's a resident. John, are you here today? Okay. John, all right. So John's brother, Robert, wrote this book, and he flew in Vietnam for the Army in 1966. He was shot down 8 times, and he lived to tell about it. And then 50 years later, he wrote this book. There's 2 copies of this book in our library, so please take advantage of the wonderful asset we have of our library and take this or some other book. So after the Bell, then we went into another helicopter, bigger and more powerful, and here it is. This is the H-34. This is made by Sikorsky, and this was used extensively in Vietnam, especially in the early parts of Vietnam. It would hold 15 Marines, fully packed out with their rifles and other gear. Just keep this aircraft in mind because I ended up flying this in Vietnam. And I'll tell you that story in a minute. So after this training, we had been in training for now 15 months. And we graduated from training, flight school, and we were awarded our wings. So in 1967, I was awarded my wings. Our training was accelerated. At that time, flight training was to take 18 months. We went through in 15 months because of the need in Vietnam. And one of the ways they compressed our training was that we eliminated aircraft carrier landing training. Didn't I just say that Marines are on ships? So here's a photo of me and my mom and dad in June of 1967. They came to Florida to participate in the ceremony where I was awarded my wings. It was a tradition that a woman would pin the wings on the pilot. I was single, so my mom did it. And these are the wings that my mom pinned on that day. So let me pause here to just say, sometimes I'll get a question from people, how do you train a pilot for combat? And I would say, well, the biggest attribute a pilot can have is calm under pressure. Okay, well, I get that, but isn't that more relative to the individual and their demeanor? And the answer to that is yes, but you need to train for that eventuality. in truth, when you don't know how you're going to react until you get into a combat situation. But the training is such that if you know your procedures and you practice them and there's plenty of repetition, then hopefully when you get into a stressful situation, you will react and you won't have to be thinking about what am I going to do next. And I'd like to give you an example of that. This is called the Dilbert Dunker. And this is a cockpit, a mock-up of a cockpit that, and here's a pilot sitting in the mock-up. This Dilbert Dunker simulates a pilot having to ditch his aircraft at sea. And so you can see here the pilot is strapped into the cockpit. Here's the cockpit sitting on these rails, and these rails go down to the deep end of a swimming pool. When this sailor back here pulls the lever, this cockpit goes down these rails into the pool. It tips over so the pilot is upside down, underwater. So the exercise here is to stay calm, undo your seat belts, get out of the cockpit, and swim to safety. All right, here's a little video that shows this. I went to the archives and I got this video. You'll see what I mean.
A course in ditching is launched with a splash for second-class midshipmen at the Naval Academy. Dilbert the Dunker is the name of the realistic device which drops its victim in the water, then turns turtle, leaving him to unhook harness and safety belt and get out of there.
Okay. So if you practice that enough, then you should be able to do that when the time comes. So we left Florida, and I was joining a helicopter squadron in North Carolina to begin to get ready for deployment to Vietnam. And we began flying a new aircraft, and actually it was a new aircraft that had not been in service for more than a year. And here's that aircraft, again flying final to an aircraft carrier. You can see this is quite a big aircraft. This will hold 22 Marines or 35 South Vietnamese soldiers. This has twin rotors, 2 rotors, and it has 2 jet engines on it. Up to now, it was 1 rotor, 1 engine. This has 2 jet engines, and if one fails, it can fly on one engine. Here's another view of that helicopter. It's called the CH-3046, and it's built in Philadelphia by Boeing Vertol, just south of the Philadelphia International Airport. So another Philadelphia connection. In this photo, you can see up front, you can see the crew chief leaning out the door. So there's a crew of 4 in this aircraft in Vietnam. There's the 2 pilots, which are sitting up front. The pilot is in charge of the airplane. And there's a crew chief, who you see there, who's in charge of the back. He's in charge of when you're bringing on troops, or troops are deplaning, or if there's cargo, he's in charge of that. If in Vietnam there would be a 4th member, he would be in that window right behind the crew chief there, and he'd be with a .50 caliber machine gun, which was used, of course, for defense. When we'd go into a landing zone, if people were shooting at us, at least we had something to defend us. I'd like to just point out one mechanical thing on this airplane, and that's I mentioned that there's two rotors, and look at this, looks like a hump there on the back of the airplane. That is inside that is a synchronizing shaft. And that synchronizing shaft is like an axle of a car, but instead of being attached to the wheels, it's attached to the rotors on the helicopter. The purpose of that synchronizing shaft is that these rotors mesh. They intermesh with each other. And the only way they don't cause damage to each other is because of this synchronizing shaft that does that. Here's another aircraft. This aircraft was used for 35 years for the President of the United States for local trips. This was used for Nixon through Obama. And it was a common sight to see this helicopter on the lawn of the White House waiting for the president to take him and his family or whatever to Camp David or wherever they were going. Here's a video of the CH-46, and this shows some of the capabilities of this airplane. You can see here we're flying off of a carrier, off the ship. Here it is on land with Marines on board. Here's the Marines deplaning. Here we are on the ship picking up cargo and taking the cargo to another ship. It could be ammunition that was on a larger ship being taken to a ship that was going to take the ammunition to land. It's a powerful helicopter that can lift very heavy loads. When you have a load like that swinging underneath the airplane, it handles very differently than it does without a load. Here he is transferring that cargo to a moving ship. Again, on the carrier, picking up more cargo and transporting it to another ship. Here, the helicopter is also used for rescue. So here's a Navy helicopter rescuing a pilot this is simulating the action. He's had to abandon his plane. He's in the water in a raft and he's being picked up. Okay, so while I was doing all this training, many months of training, what was going on in Vietnam? Well, the fighting has intensified. The fighting was much different than it was in 1961. Now there was a large buildup of the North Vietnamese in the South. Up until a certain point, everybody thought this was a local war, when in fact it was not. But at some point, the North Vietnamese began to show themselves, and there was a combined force of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese of 300,000 men. The U.S. was also building up, and in 1968, our forces reached 400,000. So we were getting ready to deploy to Vietnam. As part of this deployment, it was going to be in November of 1967, and we were throwing a curveball. And here's the curveball. This plane was grounded. And remember I told you about that synchronizing shaft? It was starting to develop cracks, and it was breaking. And when it broke, those rotors would chew themselves up. There was 3 incidents where that happened, 2 in Vietnam and 1 in California, and there were 18 servicemen killed, pilots and crew on the helicopter. So it was grounded. and it was grounded for about 3 months. It was Boeing Vertol's job to fix this problem. And fix it they did, but it took over 3 months to get it done. Now, where is Paul Goldberg? Because Paul worked for Boeing Vertol at that time, and he was in the quality assurance department, and it was partly his job to help solve that problem. So we deployed to Vietnam, not in this helicopter, but in that H-34 I showed you earlier that I asked you to keep in mind. It's not the best way, I would say, for a squadron to deploy not being able to fly the helicopter that you were trained in. So here's South Vietnam in 1968. I'm just going to show you quickly. Here's North Vietnam and Hanoi. Here's South Vietnam and Saigon. Here's the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, and here's the city of Hue right here. The Marine Corps, their area of responsibility was the DMZ south for about 100 miles and from the coast over to the border of Laos. We were stationed right here just below Hue. Here's a picture of where we were. We were at the Phu Bai Airport, which is here. It's a Marine and Army air base. Here it is here. And here's the city of Hue. This is important because I'm going to be talking about the Battle of Hue, and look how close we were. You can see that we're right on the coast here. Here's a picture of Phu Bai in its early days. You can see it's sandy and it's scrubby. Here's a picture. I'm not talking so much in this picture about the Army soldier that you see pictured here. I don't know who he is. I wanted to show you our living quarters on either side. These are called hooches. And for us, there was about 8 to 10 pilots in each hooch. And you can see this guy is sitting on sandbags. Those sandbags are used to protect the hooch. And they needed protection because almost every night there were rocket attacks on the airbase. And those sandbags were used to protect us while we were sleeping, because you slept on a cot and you slept probably a foot below those sandbags. I want to tell you a story about the hooches, because in March of 1968, my grandmother died back here in the States. I was very close to my grandmother. She helped raise me. So when the message came through Marine headquarters that I had to go up and see the commanding officer, and he told me that my grandmother had died, and they knew that I was very close to her, so he offered 10 days leave to go home for her funeral, which I did. But before I got back, on my way back, and before I arrived back in Phu Bai, there was a rocket attack that hit in our hooch area, and one of our hooches was hit, and a Marine pilot was severely injured and had to be evacuated. So I always felt my grandmother was taking care of me even after she passed. Here's a photo of the Phu Bai chapel. Why am I showing you a picture of the chapel? Well, here I was, 25 years old, 13,000 miles from home, with a lot of uncertainty, not knowing what the next day's mission would bring or whether we were going to get back safely. And I was looking for things that were familiar, that would give me comfort. And going to Mass on Sunday mornings in Phu Bai is something that helped me cope with those feelings. So then the Tet Offensive hit, and that's what I wanted to talk about. About a month period in the beginning of January, from January 30th, 1968 until 28th or so, the Tet Offensive hit. This was considered to be a turning point in the war. And it's also considered to be one of the most pivotal battles in the war. It was a surprise attack across the entire South Vietnamese country by a combined force of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. It was a total surprise. Tet is the biggest holiday in Vietnam. It celebrates their new year, and it's their biggest celebration. In the years past, both sides would stand down on Tet so that there would be no fighting and people could celebrate the holiday. But in this year, we expected that to happen, but that did not happen. Instead, this huge offensive was launched by the North Vietnamese all across Vietnam and hitting almost all of the population centers. It was designed to fracture the U.S. and South Vietnamese alliance, and it was designed to damage U.S. morale, not just in country, but also back home. It was a turning point in the war. The Viet Cong did not wear uniforms. They would dress just like other South Vietnamese civilians. So this attack was planned for several months. We know that now. We didn't know it at the time. And the Viet Cong went into the various cities, and they were there. They didn't know what was going to happen or when it was going to happen. It was kept very secret by the North Vietnamese, but they were there in place when the attacks began. This is a map that I just have to point out to you. Here is South Vietnam. Here's the demilitarized zone. Here's where we were in Hue. But all these starbursts that you see here were all battles that took place all simultaneously. This was a headline from a newspaper back home. Reds open up, 7 provincial capitals attacked. So what was the significance of Hue City? Because it turned out to be the biggest and bloodiest battle of the Tet Offensive, and it was 3 miles from our air base. Tet was Hue is the ancient capital of Vietnam. For 150 years, it was the capital city of Vietnam. It's where the royal family lived. They had an emperor until 1945, and in Hue is where they lived with their palaces and fortifications, and they lived in a walled city similar to what we've heard about in China. And that's where the royal family lived, so it was a very symbolic target for the Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese took over Hue. The Marine Corps response was to take it back. There were many civilian casualties. There are estimates that 5 to 10% of the civilians in the city of Hue were killed. The Marine response was to take back the city, and we were flying at times in bad weather. Here's a picture in Hue of Marines fighting. You can see it's urban. It was house-to-house fighting, and you can see there's not too many places where you can land a helicopter in these areas. Our job was to insert the troops into the city, our troops into the city, to resupply them and to take the medevac, which is what it sounds like when someone's wounded, to remove them and get them to medical attention. Here's a picture of the Citadel in Hue that is a 200-year-old building, and that was in the city where the emperor and others lived. This was taken over by the North Vietnamese, and it was held for 24 days. Probably 90% are the estimates of the old city was damaged during that period of time because, as I said, it was house-to-house fighting. So the challenges of flying in combat in this way where there were limited landing zones, there was a heavy enemy fire, we were in the urban terrain, and we were having to sometimes go in and pull Marines out who were in trouble. Whenever you got called on an extraction, that was to get the Marines out, it was because they were in trouble and they were being shot at. This was the least favorite kind of mission because you knew when you flew that mission, you were going to be shot at. Here's a picture of a Marine helicopter that had been hit and was on fire. You can see down at the bottom of the screen, there are the Marines in the landing zone that were waiting for the helicopter to come in. This helicopter was coming in to take the Marines out. It was hit by fire, it's on fire, and it's a forced landing in that zone. At least it would be with some other Marines to protect it. This was not an uncommon sight in Vietnam. I lost two friends, two pilots who lived in the hooch with me. Their cots were directly across from mine. And we lost them in two separate incidents a week apart. And I can tell you, even when you're 25 years old, that's a difficult thing to take. They were there one day, and the next day their cots were empty. There was two other pilots in our squadron that were shot down like this, and we thought they were dead. It turns out that they were not, that they were captured. They were taken to North Vietnam, and they spent 5 years there in a prison in North Vietnam in a place called the Hanoi Hilton. You remember hearing about that. John McCain made that famous, I think. So, right in the middle of the Tet Offensive, we were transferred to the aircraft carrier. Remember, we didn't have aircraft training. This was planned for quite a while. And so, right in the middle of the battle, we were taken to an aircraft carrier. Generally, aircraft carrier duty was considered favorable duty because there was no rocket attacks. So we were on the USS Valley Forge, so another connection with Philadelphia, and we were flying day and night medical evacuation. And we were landing often at night in heavy seas. Here's a picture of the Valley Forge. I want to show you this video, a short video that shows what it's like trying to land on a ship in heavy seas. This pilot is trying to time his landing properly. I think I can tell you that that's not the landing that he was planning. So I want you to just imagine this landing at night with wounded Marines on board. So it was a hairy situation. Okay, so let me progress here. So eventually we prevailed in the Tet Offensive. We had the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese combined had 60,000 killed in the Tet Offensive. The U.S., we lost 3,000, and the South Vietnamese lost about 6,000. The Viet Cong actually were so degraded they weren't really an effective fighting force after that. Their morale was very low, and the North Vietnamese began to take over much of the fighting. There was 58,000 dead, so we paid a very heavy price as a country in human terms. There are still 1,600 missing. To this day, there's 1,600 missing. There were 2,200 helicopter pilots killed. That's over 5% of the total. So in a room like this of 100 people, 5 of us would not make it. In 1973, I was now out of the Marine Corps. A peace treaty was signed in Paris by Henry Kissinger. This was the headline: "It's peace. It's all over." But it wasn't all over, because there were still 600 POWs in North Vietnam that this treaty allowed to be brought home. So in a period of maybe 3 months in early 1973, it was called Operation Homecoming. We brought all 600 POWs back in over a period of 3 months. And there were celebrations each time an aircraft landed with the POWs. I remember when MJ and I were in our apartment in Northeast Philadelphia, we were watching TV one day and we were watching the POWs come back, and I couldn't believe what I saw, that those 2 pilots I told you that were shot down and were in North Vietnam, I saw them coming off the aircraft, and their names were announced, their service and their rank, and I saw the 2 guys that were in my squadron. I couldn't believe it, and it was a wonderful feeling. So what are my personal experience? I talked a bit about the fear and the anxiety that we felt, but there was also a lot of personal satisfaction and a feeling of professionalism. We had a job to do, we went and did the job, and we did it well. There was losses and heroism in South Vietnam. I was a very lucky individual to come back healthy in one piece. But there was a lot of frustration too, because when we came home, it was the first time returning servicemen and women were not celebrated. In fact, not only not celebrated, but some of us were vilified. It was not a proud time in our history. And I think some of it was because the people back home were equating the government policies that were hated with the servicemen and women that went to do the job. Now, thank God that changed, but it took probably 20 to 25 years for that to change. But now it's not uncommon to hear someone saying, "Thank you for your service." This is the Vietnam Wall in Washington, D.C. There's 58,000 names etched in marble there. If you've ever been there and if you're looking for an individual and you find them and you touch it, it's a moving experience. So from my own life experience, because of my participation in the Marine Corps, I've gained a lot of confidence in my own abilities. It gave me leadership abilities that held me well in business, and I'm proud to have served. And one thing I should tell you that is because of the Marine Corps that I met MJ. The best thing that ever happened to me. Finally, I'm going to close with this. This is a picture of our son Andrew with his wife Tam and their dog Bruno. In the end of May of this year, MJ and I went to Florida, and we were at Andrew's wedding where he married Tam, who is a Vietnamese lady. Tam and her family emigrated here a few years after the war, so now we have a beautiful Vietnamese daughter. That's my story. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry I didn't leave much time for questions here.
That was just fabulous. Thank you so much. Does anyone have a question? Colin and I will run around.
To what do you attribute the fact that a communist country prevailed over a world-class military like ours?
Well, that's a very good question, and okay. How did a world-class power like ourselves not prevail against a communist country that had a less sophisticated military? And I think it's not because we didn't fight well. We won almost every battle, but we lost the support at home. Every night, people in the United States would see the Walter Cronkite on television and all the talking about Vietnam and all the casualties and the dead coming home. And right after, the reason Tet Offense was called a turning point in the war, because after that, more people were against the war than were supporting it.
Other questions?
Yes, Frank?
Jack, how many combat hours did you actually fly?
Combat hours, it was, I guess, about 400 I had, 400. Yes.
Jack, thank you for this. It was amazing. Was amazing. Oh, there we go. How did you prepare to land on the aircraft carriers if you didn't have training?
It was
How did that go?
it was on-the-job training, really, and it was a scary situation, especially at night when there was low visibility and you're having to land on the carrier, and it was not a great feeling doing that, but eventually we learned how to do it. I should mention, too, before I close here today, that 2 months from today in this room is Veterans Day, and we always have a ceremony in this room to celebrate our veterans. Frank Burke is the head of that committee now. Tom Lloyd has turned that over to Frank, and we invite you to attend on November the 11th, 2 months from today, in this room at 10 o'clock.
Other questions?
Jack, I don't know if we overlooked anyone, but Jeb Stillman, weren't you in Vietnam? No? Oh, okay. Okay, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I didn't know if anybody else was missed.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you. It was just thrilling. Thank you.